Global wars are probably the most interesting part of politics and war. Thousands of players get together to destroy each other's stuff, trash talk for a month, and decide who the best players and alliances are. The anticipation for the next global and the surprise when it starts is part of the fun, but not if you don't have enough resources to participate or you're going to be stuck on the losing side. In this video, I am going to be teaching you how to predict global wars. That way you can prepare for them, dodge them, or just spoil the surprise. Oh, and just to highlight the significance of this video, currently there are only like a dozen players which consistently predict global wars. That is a stupidly low number, and most of the game's diplomats aren't included in it. Let's start with the long-term indicators, since those are the ones people tend to overlook. Holiday wars. Members of the strongest alliances tend to be in higher education or working. Exam season is really rough on them and their activity sharply declines. And in the holidays their activity goes through the roof. So if big alliances want people to show up for the war, they plan to start it during the holidays. It's as simple as that. Just note down when the US's summer break is. That's when global wars are. Christmas is an interesting example of this practice. No one wants to be on their phone during Christmas, so there aren't that many wars on the day. However, wars in the weeks leading up to Christmas are incredibly popular. Return on investment. Infrastructure is expensive and it takes roughly a month or two to earn as much as it's worth. This money is then saved up so they can rebuild the infrastructure after next war. Another thing to consider is growth. Alliances don't fight as soon as they're able to. Instead, they wait for a couple months to buy cities, land, and projects. Generally, alliances with smaller nations want this growth period to last as long as possible so that they can catch up with the big nations. Inversely, alliances with large nations will want to fight as frequently as possible to maximize the gains of their current advantage. You can use return on investment to predict wars really easily. All you do is find the date of their last war and see how many months have passed. If more than 3 months have passed, they're capable of fighting another war. If more than 6 months have passed, they'll be happy to fight another war. Economic competition. This is a weird one that confuses diplomats more than any other type of player. War is economic. Alliances fight wars to destroy their opponent's infrastructure, consume their resources, and set them back economically. No one disputes this fact. However, alliances are not thinking in terms of days, weeks, or months. Alliances are thinking in terms of years. It doesn't matter who's strong today, it matters who's strong at the end of the year. I spoke about return on investment before, and it's related to this idea of economic competition. The major spheres are roughly balanced. They have a similar number of nations, and they have a similar amount of money. However, some of them fight more frequently than others, and this means they take more damage, and they lose more nations, and they lose more money. Over time, the alliances that fight more will start to decline in relative strength. To keep the game balanced, then each of the major spheres has to suffer an equal amount of damage each year, and they'll work together to achieve this, or to avoid it, if they're winning. If an alliance goes 6 months without a war, and their rivals have only gone 2 months without a war, you can bet another war is coming soon, and those rivals will be working together to take on the alliance that's avoiding it. This is probably what happened to the Syndicate at the start of 2022. They lost half as much as their competitors did in 2021, and they were getting a little too threatening. Oh, and this works inversely too. Camelot has been pretty anti-war after fighting a lot of wars in 2021, and losing more money than alliances 3 or 4 times their size. To be relevant again, they need to avoid wars. Time. Alliances want to be at peace for as long as possible, to a point. If they avoid war for longer than 9 months, then their staff and membership can become lazy and useless during wars. This isn't necessarily a sign that they will fight a war, since a lot of other indicators already confirm a long peace is asking for trouble. This is more like a motivation for alliances to fight wars before it goes too long, even if they're profiting. So you actually can see alliances that have enjoyed long periods of peace go on the offensive, even though it should be counterintuitive. Trash talking. Propaganda starts before the war in the form of narratives. Diplomats try to craft stories for the community, and they usually involve one alliance being too powerful and too mean and needing to be stopped. The accuracy of the narrative doesn't matter for our purposes. All we want to know is who is mad at who, and how many people are talking about it. The more it's discussed, the more likely it is to happen. And those are the 5 big indicators you can use to predict global wars months in advance. The next 5 indicators I'll be talking about are only useful in the weeks leading up to the war. Militarization. Alliances will switch their military improvements from something like a factory and 5 hangars per city to 5 barracks, 5 factories, 5 hangars, and 3 dry docks per city. They will max their military improvements. At this stage, it's possible alliances will still back down and demilitarize, though it hasn't happened in 5 years. Next, they'll wait for a day change and buy units before and after it. This will give them a head start on militarization, and the war usually starts when they've reached max military. The target of the war will begin to militarize as soon as they see their opponent buy military, or switch improvements if they're paying attention. The target is almost always a day behind on militarization, and the alliance that militarizes first is also more likely to be the aggressor. Social cues. Before a war, alliances will start distributing war resources, stop providing money for new cities, and stop members from withdrawing their savings. They do this to preserve as much cash as possible to rebuild infrastructure after the war. If you quiz another alliance's members on this, they'll tell you about it, so just ask. No loans. If a global war is approaching, then bankers are amongst the first to find out. The larger nations and alliances will approach the banks to secure loans for after the war. This means that bankers won't lend out that money to anyone else, and they definitely won't lend it out to the people they expect to participate. Rebuild loans are large and have very high interest. Bankers never want to miss out on them. Empty market. Global wars consume a lot of manufactured resources, and alliances are often short of steel and occasionally some of the others. It's not uncommon to see alliances spend billions to buy all the steel on the market, to fill their war chest and deny the enemy resources. Leaks, specifically Protectorate leaks. War plans are leaked all the time. For a global war to happen, then literally dozens or hundreds of staffers need to know about it in advance and prepare. Despite that, the easiest and most useful leaks you can get are often from the Protectorates and not the government of larger alliances. Protectorates tend to be told about the war a couple of days in advance, and receive regular updates on how long it's expected to last. They're also much more willing to share that information without realizing they're betraying their allies. And because they don't realize, they're also less likely to have their access removed. These are all the indicators I use. There are probably others which you could employ, such as using spies or monitoring mercenaries to see if they've been hired in upcoming wars. The skill ceiling on predicting wars and the outcomes of wars is really high. There's never a shortage of things to learn. But that said, it's still pretty easy to do. Hopefully you find these indicators useful. Some of them are contradictory, and that's just how it is. Alliances aren't stupid and context matters. Sometimes one of these indicators will be way more important than the others. Economic competition might fall by the wayside as some big scandal happens, or it might be that all the trash talking they're doing today isn't to set up the next war, it's to set up the war after this one, right? They're setting it up months in advance instead of weeks. There's different things that could be happening. So you gotta try and use as many indicators as you can to figure out what's most likely. And for everyone that finished the video, you get a bonus indicator. This is actually the simplest indicator, so congrats. Alliances don't like to fight the same wars back to back against the same opponents. They like to spice things up a little bit and make slight changes to their coalitions. A perfect example of this is Hollywood last year attacked Rose. Now, Rose wanted to get revenge, but Rose didn't want to fight the same war. 1, they might lose, and 2, it would be boring. So what they did is they partnered with the Syndicate, and then they had enough firepower, and it was slightly different, so they repeated that war. And Hollywood attacked Rose in the first war, and Rose attacked Hollywood in the second. The one exception to this rule, specifically the aggression part of it, is some coalitions are just naturally more aggressive than others. Clock and Hollywood are much more aggressive than, say, Syndicate and Rose have been in the past. So if there is going to be a global war, even if the target is Hollywood, and everyone knows the target is Hollywood, there is still a pretty high chance that Hollywood strikes first. The proper conclusion to this video would be me making some prediction about next war, but But I'm not really going to do that because this war's really confusing, and I have like 3 main ideas on how it'll pan out, and I have no clue which one of them it will be. So I'm going to wait till like a week before, when all the secondary indicators start occurring, and then I'll make my predictions. I think Glock will probably be center stage of it, just because they've had a really long peace period and there's several other indicators that line up. Like and subscribe. If you have any other theories or predictions of your own for next war, leave them in the comments. If they're like stellar, I will pin them.